Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. This is Tara Bradley with The Growth State, and I'm excited to have Jeff Munn with us today. He is an executive leadership coach who helps entrepreneurs build more committed teams, effective organizations. He's the author of Lead from Purpose, which I'm super excited to talk about, and I'm sure will come up in our conversation today. And so, Jeff, I love to start my conversations with people, and I think for you it's particularly probably appropriate because of your work and focus on purpose. And what I find is those of us who kind of get into this realm of helping people, or helping a lot of people, is there was some pain point for us in our life, whether it's personal or professional, where we said, I feel like I don't want to do that again, number one. And
Yeah.
number two, I can help someone not have to do that. Or if they do have to do it, in a way that's not maybe as painful as what I had to go through. What was that for you?
Wow. You're just putting me on the couch right away here, huh? Yeah. So I talk about this a little bit in the book, I think. When I was growing up, I always felt this, like two things. One, this sense that we all have, I think, at one point or another, especially people who go down the entrepreneurial path, this sense of not being enough. And I also had this sense, and I don't know that my parents were necessarily overt about it. So it may be just a story I made up in my head, frankly, but it was one that really kind of hurt. Was that I was different, that I wasn't really appreciated for who I was. I had this amazing father, and he died many years ago, but he was a huge influence on me. But at the same time, he was very different than me. So he was, the quarterback on the football team. He was the homecoming king. He was, incredibly popular and friendly, and everybody loved my dad. And I wasn't him. I was kind of this, chubby, smart kid. And so I had to develop these different strategies to get attention and to get approval. And I found out I was good at school. And so I got good grades, and I kind of had this overachiever vibe to me for many years. That was my way of navigating the world. And at the same time, there was this pain underneath of like, well, I'm only worthy if I'm getting good grades,
Mm-hmm.
or if I'm becoming a law firm lawyer, or if I'm becoming a partner in a consulting firm, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so, a lot of the work that I do with people is just, I have found that I instinctively see possibilities in people that they don't see for themselves. And I instinctively see how amazing people are. And a lot of my work with people is just helping them see that in themselves, and doing things that they otherwise might not feel capable of doing.
Awesome. I love that. I often tell my teams, especially if they're struggling with someone on their team, I'm like, hey, everybody's a genius at something. It's our job to figure out what that is and kind of help them through it. And I love that that's where you come at this from, and particularly for this audience, because so many of us, we took a huge leap of faith and said, we're going to start this company, and we have this idea, and it might be a little bit different than everyone else. And I think in the beginning, we are motivated and pushed by excitement and, oh, this is going to be great. And then you get that first little stumbling block, or you stub your toe, and you're like, who am I? Like, what's so special about me that makes me think that this is going to be amazing? And I think that's why we get on this hamster wheel of working harder and harder and harder, and not focusing on, that great outcome that we were excited about in the beginning, because we have exactly what you said. We start to think, who am I? What am I? I'm not good enough to do this. Why would I be able to do this when so many other people have failed? So I love that you shared that, and it makes me even more excited about our conversation. So let's see. I got derailed there because I got excited about that. So you write about purpose, and I think that you and I probably share the same perspective. Is people get into entrepreneurship for 100 different reasons. Sometimes it's, I want to make more money and I feel like I can do that on my own. I want the freedom. I want the flexibility. But I think when they finally get into it and they start to feel this kind of authenticity problem, which I think you kind of talked about, is, am I being authentic? It's probably because they're not tied back to their purpose. And I think everybody goes through that when they're trying to mature their organization, right? And that's what a lot of this group is scaling their organization. And I think they almost feel like they have to take a step back, and they don't know that the step back is that purpose piece. How do you walk people through that?
Right. Well, I think, the point of scaling is a really interesting one, because at the point of scaling, you oftentimes have an idea that has had some success. Maybe you've gotten some clients, you're getting some business, you're getting some revenue in the door. Maybe you're getting some investor interest, that kind of thing. And so I find that that step back, if you will, it's almost a contraction and an expansion at the same time. So I find there's two different things going on. One is one is physiological and one is psychological. So at the beginning, there's this huge rush, and there's this bias for action, and there's this activity, and it's almost like, and many of the entrepreneurs I've spoken with, I can actually hear it in their voice. I can actually see it in their physiology. They're breathing from up here. They're talking really fast. They're literally in fight or flight. And so fight or flight is really good if you know exactly what you're doing. I've got a friend who I worked with in a law firm years ago, and he told me something. He said, give me an unreasonable deadline and enough caffeine and I can do anything. Right? And so it's really that caffeinated, hyperactive state is really good for getting stuff done when you know exactly what you have to do, but it's really narrow. So if I know what I'm running at, that fight or flight stage is very useful. But at some point I have to step back from that, and I have to say, okay, if I continue to try to do all these things for myself, and this is maybe a little bit of that letdown that you're talking about, like I'm getting exhausted. I can't sleep. My mind kind of wanders all over the place. I'm not as excited about this as I once was. And that's a sign that, you've kind of overdone it on the adrenaline junkie phase of this, and you need to step back and you need to think about the bigger picture. And so some of that is this idea of purpose. Am I doing the right thing? Some of it is about, okay, I've shepherded this through the first phase, but to grow bigger, I actually need to give that up. I need to give up the sense of control. I need to give up the idea that I am the one who has to do everything. I am the one who has to come up with the best ideas. And instead, I need to bring in people. Now, this is the point where you start to bring in like functional heads, like I've got a head of marketing, I've got a head of product, I've got a head of sales, et cetera, right? And so you need to bring in these people and create this bigger vision for these people and let them run. And that's a different part of your brain. So that fight or flight, it's more focused on the analytical side of your brain. It's more focused on, serial processing, if you will. If you think about a computer, now you're moving into parallel processing. You're moving into holistic thinking. You're moving into thinking about the future and the next version of the idea. And these are harder questions that don't have clear answers. In a way, you have to let go the easy stuff and say, head of sales, we need this many clients. Head of product, we need these 2 or 3 things. These 2 or 3 developmental issues are primary. Setting those priorities for people, and sometimes you even bring in someone to do that for you, a COO type, so you can retain like the visionary control. And that scares people because it's like, wait a minute, I got all these little dopamine hits from getting things done on my to-do list, and I felt like we were making progress. And now I'm stepping back into stuff that I don't know the answer. I don't know if I'm good at it. And so there's this natural tendency. And I'm also kind of used to being an adrenaline junkie and
Mm-hmm.
kind of addicted to that buzz, right?
Yeah.
And it's hard to step back from that. It requires the psychological shift, the identity shift to say, I'm moving from the person who knows all the answers to the person who's leading a team of people who are smarter than me toward this collective future.
Mm-hmm. And I totally agree with that. And it brings to mind two questions that I've got for you, but just to kind of recap a little bit, what I hear you saying is it's, you know, we're in the land of hustle, right? You hear it, you see it all the time. There's all these, you got to hustle, hustle, hustle. And I totally agree. There's a time and a place for that. And sometimes even after you've made that transition, you got to rally the troops that same way. But you also have to evolve, and you have to evolve a team. And you know, those are things you have to do. Tell me a little bit, because I'm sure you've seen this, and I know a little bit about the background and the platform of your work. But tell us about those CEOs that really struggle with that, you know, bringing in a team or saying, I can't be the visionary and the executor.
Mm-hmm.
And the conversation you have to get them okay with one or the other, right? Because if they're really going to grow and scale, they have to kind of pick a path. They either need to mature to that very strategic kind of widespread leader, or they need to really keep working on those really great, awesome ideas and, you know, help someone else go out and execute on that strategy. So how do you help them through that process? Because not everybody is meant to be, you know, that long-term CEO that can be very strategic. They are meant to be the idea person and let someone else go and do that. So how do you kind of take them through that process?
Yeah, so I'm thinking about, I'm actually thinking about a couple different client situations. One, he literally told me, I feel like I'm stuck between being a small company and being a big company, and the thing that's getting in the way is me.
So true.
And right, and so the ongoing work for us, and we continue. I mean, we've been working on this for a couple years. Is you know, that the advantage that he has is he's been in this business for 20 years. He knows it backwards and forwards. That gets in his way though, because it's an impediment to him hiring and trusting people who don't know the business as well as he does. Well, by his own definition, right?
Right.
Like it's hard to say
Yeah.
whether this is a story he's creating in his head
Exactly.
or this is the reality. But like, you know, Jeff, I'd be, you know, I would be happy to let this go if I could find people good enough to delegate this to.
Mm-hmm.
And so we've done this series of experiments. I like the coach who trained me, a guy named Doug Silsby, who passed away a couple years ago, but just an amazing guy. He liked to talk about safe to fail experiments. And so how do you put your toe in the water and say, well, you know what? I realize you can't just hire someone in and give them the entire finance function of your business or whatever it happens to be, right? But what if you give them this? You know, what is something that if they messed it up, your business isn't going to fail, but if they, you know, if they prove themselves, it's going to be a big benefit to you. And so a lot of that is, you know, you've got all this stuff that comes up as a leader when it's time to let something go. This feeling of it's not only like, can I trust them? It's also like, well, who am I if I'm not doing all this cool stuff anymore? That's a tough shift for people too. And you just over and over again, you have the conversation of like, well, what can you give up next? What can you give up next? What can you give up next? And it's not an easy shift for many people, and it takes some time.
Yeah. And I think too, you know, founder CEOs, I think a lot of times it's very true, right? They are so ingrained in their niche that they may be a leading industry expert in that one thing that they're in. And what we fail to realize is by not letting go of the things that we're not the expert in, we're
Yeah.
taking away from, the value that we add in that other area of the business. I think that's
Right.
super insightful.
Wait,
Which
yeah,
leads
yeah.
my,
Just let me add one thing to
yeah,
that, Tara, because one thing that I ask people often is, what is the thing that only you can do? And give up the rest of it. So there is generally some magic. Sometimes it's the network that a founder has. I mean, I've worked with founders who have started up things 2, 3, 4 times and literally sold them to the same network
mhm,
of clients. Like,
yeah,
idea one, go out, hey, we got a better one.
right,
And so sometimes it's the network and the connections. Sometimes it's the technical knowledge of a particular thing, and that's their magic. And you want to keep them in a technical role, and you want to get them out of like having to interact with a customer. I had a client who told me once, my dream job involves no interaction with any customers, because he was like
yeah,
technical and focused and process, and like give him a problem and he would figure it out. So yeah, I think you're exactly right on that
yeah.
point.
Well, and it's kind of, I can't remember if I read it or I just made it up over years. We share and share alike, right? But I
Yeah,
kind of refer to it when I'm talking to people, and like, live in your zone of genius and
yeah,
require that everyone else does too. And if you do that and you work well together, you don't have any options but to really excel, right? If you've got a great idea, you've already got some traction, but everybody in their zone of genius, and it should be relatively easy at that point.
yeah. And I think a really effective leader who is able to step back and kind of build culture and build connection, um, they can help people see their zone of genius, maybe in
Hmm.
a way that, because there are things that we're all good at,
Right,
and we confuse that with our zone of genius. Like
right.
I can, there's this one particular thing that I can crank out all day long. I really don't have to think about it. I'm really good at it, but I don't love it. There might be this other thing that I'm just as good at that I absolutely love, and the right leader will let me do that.
Yeah, perfect. This leads right into my second question, which we've come back to is, so you've kind of gotten through that and you recognize, and for those of you watching, we've talked to a few of our different guests that have said, you want funding, it's all about the team, right? They are investing in a team. And so I'd love for you to expand on the idea that, this CEO evolution involves defining your purpose and getting okay with your role in the company, but then it's time to fill your team.
Mhm.
How do you, and let's assume that there's enough trust there, they feel like they can build that team. How do they impart their view on purpose to these people in a way that's really effective? Because we know, as CEOs and owners and founders of company, that business is very, very personal to us, but it
Yeah.
might not be to the next person. But we need to get that heart of the business out to them. How do you do that as you're looking for a leader?
I think, this is a really interesting question. And I think there's different viewpoints on it. And you talked about one, kind of imparting it. I think another way, so imparting can definitely work, don't get me wrong.
Mhm.
Um, I think uh, the other way that you could potentially do it is just to say in the interview process, this is what I believe, this is why I've established this company. And you're not only looking for a skill set, but you're looking for um, someone who resonates at the heart level with what you're trying to do. So it's not necessarily that you're trying to convince them. You're trying to find people that already believe that.
Mhm.
So if you're creating, I mean, I do a lot of work with healthcare entrepreneurs. So if you're creating a different way of helping people with cancer, or a different way of helping people to understand what their benefits mean or whatever, talk about that, and talk about why it's important to you, and talk about, the thing in your background that created that resonance. And you'll often find or attract people with similar stories. And when you get when you get all those people in a room who believe the same thing, man, you're going to be on fire.
Yeah, for sure. Um, let's see. We've gone 100 different ways. None of the ways which were the questions I had already written down. So I'm going back to see what makes sense. From your perspective, and I think we're leading into this with the last question of how do you build the team, you know, that has a sequential effect, right? Like, because you're building out, you are then trusting those leaders to do the same thing with their teams. And then, you know, eventually, if you're looking for an exit, to communicate that in a way that's defensible, like, hey, this is the core of the team and how we've created a culture and a purpose. And I know that, you know, some people are viewing culture as this, you know, it's in their mind, it's like, I'm hiring people just like me. You know, my culture is this defined thing. And I think you take it a level further when you start to talk about purpose. How do you make sure, you know, we've talked about the CEO and how they evolve and then their team, but how do you make sure it permeates through the whole company?
Culture?
Well, just and maybe your definition of the difference between the two.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, culture starts from the first time you hire an employee.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you're voting on the culture with every new person you bring in. And so I think you can, you know, some of that's unconscious. And I think you're right. There is this tendency to, oh, well, I'll bring in people like me. And that's not necessarily what you need to be doing. Because on the one hand, you need to bring in people who believe as you do and behave as you do. But you also need to bring in people with different skill sets and also people who are willing to challenge you and say, I think you're wrong on this one.
Yeah.
I mean, and so some of that, you know, that's a cultural issue too. Are you going to be a top-down militaristic kind of leader? You know, I'm just looking for order takers. Or are you going to be a person who really encourages and creates a safe space for debate? You know, I had a conversation with one of my clients who, I mean, he runs a company. They've got probably 70 employees at this point, you know, 25 million in revenue, somewhere in there. So they're in that beginning to scale phase, and he's got a pretty effective leadership team. He's always trying to make the team more effective. And he's very approachable, but I'm not, but his predecessor was not. His predecessor was the founder, more of a, this is the way we're doing things. My client wanted to create a different culture. And in large part, he's done that, but there's still that, that after effect of the old culture.
Sure.
And one of the things we've emphasized in our work together is how do you create a safe space for criticism, for conflict, et cetera, et cetera. And I believe, you know, if you want to be a militaristic by the numbers kind of leader, that's great. But I can't remember who said this. It might have been Harry Truman. I might get this wrong. But basically the thought was, you know, if you and I agree on everything, one of us is unnecessary.
Right.
Right. So if all I'm doing is teaching you to do exactly what I would have done, that's not a very leveraged model. Right.
Right.
I mean, what we're trying to do is create this rich conversation around these questions that are ambiguous so that we can decide together how to move. You know, ultimately the leader makes the decision, we're going to go forward. That's the role of the CEO. But the effective CEO creates this culture in which we can talk about things. We can even fight it out to some extent and feel like, oh, my job isn't on the line, or you know, we're still going to be able to talk after this conversation, right? And so that I think to me is real. And I don't know if I'm, you know, I'm thinking back. I don't know if I'm exactly answering your question, but that to me
perfect
is one of the most effective things that a leader can do in terms of building a culture, is that culture of collaboration and even conflict rather than just do as I say.
Yeah. My dad was a cattle rancher, and he always used to tell us, I don't need you both riding the same horse. Like, kind of the
Yeah,
same thing.
yeah,
Like, you're gonna have the exact same ideas, do the exact same thing. We'll save a horse. You could just get on together. So
right.
you bring
Yeah,
a really good point there. And I know we're about out of time, but I want to ask you this one last question.
sure.
There is an inherited culture too, right? And we know as founders and CEOs that are scaling companies, the team that we started with may not be the team that gets us to the next phase, especially if the team, your first hire was your brother or
Right.
your sister, or, and talk to me about those conversations, because I think there's also, we see this phenomenon in scaling companies where the legacy folks feel a little bit of entitlement and empowerment in the culture that was there
Uh,
before.
uh-huh.
And then, we bring in leaders and we say we've trusted this team to build it and grow it forward, but they're inheriting, a legacy, and that they've either got to retool or they've got to move forward. What's the biggest success factor in your mind of making that transition well, and trying to preserve, and be respectful of what was there before you, but move it forward?
I think there's a ruthless honesty that's required at that point, because I was actually working with a company that was exactly at this point, and they were about 10 years in, and they had, a fair number of, not necessarily the leadership team, but like the layer below the leadership team had been there from the beginning. And they were people who were attracted to this young upstart company with a big idea. They were people who were used to having a lot of balls in the air and figuring a lot of things out. They were used to having a lot of autonomy and authority, but they weren't necessarily really good at one particular thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so when the time came to say, okay, now we need to be a little bit more siloed than we were before, we need people to have functional expertise, they had to take a really hard look at each of those people and say, is there still a place for you here? And for quite a few of them, there just wasn't. They weren't good enough at one thing anymore. They were like the utility infielder, right? They could play all the positions, but they weren't going to be an all-star at anything.
Right.
And now, sometimes you need a third baseman.
Right.
And the person who came off the bench and could play third base isn't going to cut it anymore. And so how do you do that with clarity and compassion and say, thanks so much for your contributions, but we really think you'd be better off someplace else at this point.
Yeah. And that's a whole nother hour, a half hour we could spend talking about that,
Sure.
right? Because I think a lot of us deal with that, and helping people, if they're not a great fit for you, find a soft spot to land somewhere else is a skill that you really have to develop as a founder, CEO who's growing a company and scaling it. Because you're absolutely right. I mean, you'll find people that aren't a great fit, or you've moved them into a leadership role when they don't have the capacity to expand in that way anymore. They need to go back to an individual contributor, and now
Right.
they're not looking for that. So I
And
definitely,
that could even be true with the founder. Sometimes the founder wants to be the coder.
yeah.
And that's perfectly okay. And you see people bring in, the professional CEO who really is the good manager and operational and systems and cultural expert, while the founder is perfectly happy to go to a narrower role.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Well, Jeff, we are out of time, and I appreciate you taking the time today. Tell the people watching how they can get in contact with you if they're interested in working with you.
Yeah, so there's my website, which is jmunn, MUNN.com. And also, I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. As far as social media goes, that's the best way to reach out to me. Reach out and direct message me or send me an invitation on LinkedIn, and I'd be happy to have a conversation.
Perfect. And we'll have all of Jeff's information on his bio page, and you can link out and definitely get more info on his book as well, which I think is a great investment for anybody that's looking for ideas and just thought processes on how to elevate bringing purpose into your business. So Jeff, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Really
And I'm excited to chat with you again.
Yeah, me too. This has been great. Thanks so
Perfect.
much.
Thanks.